Okay, here we go with Chapter 14, Revolution, Reaction, and Democracy. This is Professor Joseph Holbrook teaching Latin American history, LEH 2020. Revolutions and Reactions, the introduction. Economic policies failed in the post-World War II era. Latin America still struggled with the social question. There was a vast expansion of the electorate with the inclusion of women in full suffrage. Governments eliminated literacy requirements. So Latin America was squeezed between the U.S. and the USSR, the Soviet Union, in the Cold War. So you had several different things going on. We had leftist insurgencies. After the 1959 Cuban Revolution, leftist insurgencies surged everywhere. A socialist, Salvador Allende, was elected in Chile. Major leftist insurgencies existed in Colombia, Peru, Guatemala, and El Salvador. There was a Marxist Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua in 1979. There were guerrilla movements that arose in Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina. Leftist guerrillas staged robberies, bank robberies, kidnappings, attacked police, and bombed buildings. This, of course, provoked military repression. In response to these uprisings, the Latin American militaries embarked on a reign of terror against anyone suspected of leftist sympathies from the mid-1960s through the 1980s. Military dictatorships took over and implemented ISI economic growth policies, which failed resoundingly. ISI, if you remember, is import substitution industrialization. Tens of thousands of people were tortured and disappeared, particularly in Argentina and Chile. Democracy only returned in the mid to late 1980s. After this period, we had the beginnings of a greater emphasis on a free market economy. Starting with Chile in 1973, Latin America gradually embraced free market economics. The fall of communism in the USSR in the late 1980s left radical Marxism as no longer a viable alternative to capitalism in the minds of many Latin American intellectuals. In 1990s, the most extreme left and right regimes had ended in disaster for most middle and lower class Americans. New left-of-center governments embraced neoliberal economics but focused on social welfare. If you're not familiar with the word neoliberal, that means new liberal, or it means basically hyper-free market or laissez-faire economies. Basically what we have today in the United States is neoliberal. So let's talk first about the revolutions. A series of insurrections swept through Cuba, Nicaragua, Peru, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Colombia. Let's begin with Nicaragua. Well, first let's look at the timeline. We see the Cuban Revolution at the end of the 1950s. Kennedy announces the Alliance for Progress. In 1964, there was a Brazilian military coup that eliminated reforms and democracy in Brazil for 21 years. In Peru, there was a left-leaning progressive revolution led by Juan Velasco Alvarado. In 1970, in Chile, Dr. Salvador Allende, a socialist, was elected. First time a socialist had been elected in Latin America. By 1973, Allende was ousted. 1974, Juan Perón returned to Argentina. 1979, you have the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua. 1982, the Malvinas War between Great Britain and Argentina, which led to the downfall of the Argentine military government in 83. In 88, the Chilean dictator Pinochet was voted out of office. In 1989, the Sandinistas lost their election. Alberto Fujimori is elected in Peru, and Hugo Chavez in 1999 initiates the beginning of the so-called Pink Tide. In Nicaragua, the Somoza family came to power through the control of the National Guard and ruled for 46 years, I might add, but through assistance from the U.S. Augusto Sandino was a Nicaraguan nationalist who led guerrillas against the occupation by U.S. Marines in the 1920s. He was assassinated by the Somozas in 1934. In 1972, the Somoza regime began to disintegrate when it misappropriated relief funds after a terrible earthquake in Managua. They lost credibility. Somoza also ordered the murder of his rival Pedro Joaquin Chamorro. And this was the beginning of the end for Somoza. A broad popular reaction rose up and took the name Sandinista National Liberation Front, or the FSLN. An estimated 50,000 people died in the brief but bloody war against Somoza, who fled the country in 1979. The Sandinistas ruled for the next decade without elections until 1984, when FSLN leader Daniel Ortega won the presidency. Unfortunately, the U.S. opposed the Sandinistas because of Cold War thinking during Reagan's presidency, and financed a civil war which supported the Contras, who were opposed to the Sandinistas. They were conservatives and former supporters of Somoza. 40,000 more people died during the Civil War, thanks to the Reagan's financing. Finally, there was a negotiated peace in 1989. The Sandinistas committed serious economic and administrative blunders due to their inexperience. One of those mistakes was their failure to incorporate women into the revolution. Many women were abused under Somoza, and there were many women in leadership among the Sandinistas. But the Sandinistas' women felt dismissed and disdained after the 79 revolution. Others resented the military draft. In 1990, Sandinistas lost to Violeta Chamorro, the widow of Pedro Joaquin Chamorro. In El Salvador, you either have or you will be watching the movie Romero, which deals with the civil war in El Salvador. A leftist insurgency nearly won control of the country in the 1980s. Trouble began with the slaughter of 30,000 rural Salvadorans in the 1930s under a ruthless dictator. The upper classes feared reprisals and allied themselves with a repressive military. So this led to a vicious civil war which tore the country apart. Archbishop Oscar Romero attempted to be the voice of reason on behalf of human rights, and because of his speaking up for those who were being captured and tortured, he himself was assassinated while serving Mass in 1980. And we will be watching a film about Archbishop Romero. So, from 79 to 89, 10-year period, the Augusto Farabundo Martí Front for National Liberation, FMLN, rose up in arms against the military upper-class alliance. One of the significant differences between this and the Civil War in Nicaragua was that there was massive military assistance from the United States to the Salvadoran army. Exhausted by years of armed struggle, the FMLN went to the polls in 1989 and helped elect Alfredo Cristiani of a coalition of right-wing groups. Only in 2009, a former member of the FMLN, Mauricio Funes, was elected as president of the Pink Tide, president of El Salvador, and as part of the overall trend called the Pink Tide, which includes Bolivia, Brazil, Venezuela, and Ecuador. Another situation that we should look at is Guatemala. In 1944, there was a dictator, Jorge Ubico, who had been responsible for a brutal massacre of Guatemalan peasants. He was overthrown by reformist groups in Guatemala. These reformist groups began working to do land reform under the President Jacobo Arbenz. who was democratically elected as a reformer. And so the CIA sponsored a coup against the President Arbenz, and to reverse or roll back a decade of land reforms and improvements for the working class. And President Arbenz was overthrown by this CIA coup. In my opinion, one of the more tragic involvements of the United States in Latin America. It just so happened that a young medical student was living in Guatemala City at the time named Che Guevara. And so this radicalized Che Guevara and caused him to advise Fidel Castro not to be moderate as a reformer, but to be radical, because if he was moderate, he would end up overthrown by the U.S. as Jacobo Arbenz had been in Guatemala. So in the long run, it backfired against us. In the 1960s, a guerrilla movement calling itself the Rebel Armed Forces took up arms inspired by the Cuban example in Guatemala. In 1963, there was a military coup and brutal repression with death squads against the guerrilla movement. By the 1990s, the scale of murder of Indian peasants reached genocidal proportions, causing 200,000 deaths, mostly descendants of Mayan Indians. And in class, we'll probably watch this documentary about Guatemalan genocide. There were also a number of unsuccessful insurrections in South America, attempted revolutions. One of the most bloody was the Sendero Luminoso in Peru. From the late 1960s through the 1990s, Peru experienced three revolutionary movements. The first one was the reformist military coup of 1968. Then in the 1980s, a violent guerrilla movement by the Sendero Luminoso, or the Shining Path, which terrorized the country. And then 1990, Alberto Fujimori, a descendant of Japanese immigrants, was elected ruled as an elected dictator in order to rebuild the economy, which resulted from the long-term frustrating impasse in Peruvian politics. Also in Colombia, the longest civil war in the 20th century, which is actually still going on between the Colombian insurrectionists and the Colombian government. There had been a long history of frequent civil wars between conservatives and liberals in the 19th century and the early 20th. Dysfunctional politics led to a prolonged guerrilla war in 1899 in which 100,000 people died, called the War of 1,000 Days. And in 1948 was La Violencia, which lasted 20 years and cost 200,000 or 300,000 lives. This led to a dictator in 1953 named Rojas Pinilla. He was overthrown and put out, and a national front ruled in his stead in 1957, which was an agreement by conservatives and liberals to alternate the presidency. However, it was not truly democratic because they would not allow any other parties to run for election. So in 1957, the National Front alternated presidency every 4 years and distributed appointed political offices equally for 16 years. The National Front ended the violence between the two main parties but stifled dissent. In the absence of outlets for political dissent led to the formation of guerrilla movements in the 1960s, such as the FARC, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, which is the largest. From 1986 to 2001, 300,000 Colombians died in the civil war in Colombia. An additional 2 million were displaced from their homes. By 2000, FARC controlled 15,000 soldiers. The Colombian government often seemed on the edge of collapse. Álvaro Uribe was elected in 2002, again in 2006, and he strengthened the government and the economy, and he weakened the guerrillas. The FARC remained the largest Marxist insurgency in the world, and even as we speak, the FARC is negotiating with the Colombian government in Havana to end a 50-year civil war. This brings us to the tyrannies, but we're not going to have time to talk about them. I'll have to continue in a part 2 to finish the tyrannies in Brazil and Argentina. Thank you. Please read the chapter, and we'll